Before we start, I want to say that only 1% of you are subscribed. Please subscribe because when we reach 1,000 subscribers, I will post a special video for you. Jim maneuvered through the bustling trade hub on the edge of human-controlled space, his eyes scanning the crowds for potential business partners. The station was a melting pot of cultures and species, a place where one could find anything from rare minerals to exotic foods. It was here that Jim thrived, a human among an array of galactic diversity, his knack for trade making him a well-known figure on the dock. As he haggled over a crate of Zalorian spices, a soft voice interrupted him. "Excuse me, sir," the voice said, timid yet urgent. Jim turned to find an alien woman standing behind him, her large, luminous eyes meeting his with an expression of worry. Beside her clung a small child, peeking curiously from behind her legs. Jim raised an eyebrow, his attention shifting. "Can I help you?" he asked, noticing her thin, graceful frame and the way her skin shimmered subtly in the light of the station. "Yes, I hope so," she replied, her voice steady despite the clear signs of distress. "I am Lyra, and this is my daughter, Aaliyah. I beg you to take me as your concubine, along with my child." The request took Jim by surprise, his seasoned trader's composure slipping momentarily. "I think there might be some misunderstanding," he said carefully, aware of the cultural complexities that could lead to such propositions. "No, there is no misunderstanding," Lyra insisted, her gaze intensifying. "I come from the Valerian sectors, where my options are limited. You are known here for your fairness and your kindness. My child and I are in need of protection." Jim glanced around, noting a few curious onlookers beginning to take interest. He gestured to a quieter corner of the market. "Let's talk where it's less crowded," he suggested. As they moved, Jim's mind raced. Taking in a Valerian concubine was not something he had ever intended, nor was it simple. But something in Lyra's plea tugged at him. In the quieter alley, Jim leaned against the cool metal wall. "Look, I'm just a trader. I'm not in the business of taking in, well, concubines. But maybe there's another way I can help. What are you running from?" Lyra's eyes darted around before settling back on Jim. "It's not just what I run from, but also what lies ahead. Without protection, my daughter and I are vulnerable to being claimed against our will. My people face great dangers, and without a protector, we are at great risk." Jim rubbed his chin, pondering the situation. "I run a trading ship, not a sanctuary," he said slowly. "But I'm also a father. I can offer you safe passage to a place where you can seek asylum. And work, if you're willing. You can earn your keep and stay under the radar." Lyra's relief was palpable. "Thank you," she breathed. "I can assist in many ways. I have knowledge of medicinal plants and I can translate several lesser-known dialects." "That could actually be useful," Jim admitted with a slight smile. "Let's start with your passage to the next port. We'll figure out the rest as we go." As they shook hands, Jim felt the weight of his decision. He wasn't just taking on new cargo, he was altering the course of two lives. But as he looked at Aaliyah, who now peeked at him with a hint of a smile, he felt a resolve firm within him. "All right, Lyra, Aaliyah, welcome aboard. Let's get you settled in and then we can talk more about this partnership." As they walked back towards his ship, Jim couldn't help but feel that this was the start of something far bigger than he had anticipated. Jim led Lyra and her daughter Aaliyah through the labyrinthine corridors of his trading vessel, the Starbound. The metallic clanks of the ship settling into dock echoed around them, punctuated by the distant hum of engines. Jim's crew, a small but efficient team, nodded at him as they passed by. "This here will be your quarters for the time being," Jim said, gesturing toward a compact room with bunk beds and a small viewport. "It's not luxurious, but it's safe." Lyra looked around, her eyes taking in every detail. "It's more than sufficient, thank you," she replied, placing her hand gently on Aaliyah's shoulder. As they unpacked, another figure approached the door. He was a burly man, with a broad smile and a tattoo of a solar map sprawling across his right arm. "Boss, we're all set for departure," he announced. "And who might these new faces be?" "Ah, this is Lyra and Aaliyah. They'll be traveling with us for a while," Jim explained. "Lyra, this is Marco, my second-in-command." "Nice to meet you both," Marco said, extending his hand. "Welcome aboard the Starbound." "Thank you," Lyra responded, shaking his hand. "I appreciate your hospitality." Jim clapped his hands together. "All right, let's get down to business. Lyra, you mentioned you have skills that might be of use. Care to elaborate?" Lyra nodded. "Yes, I studied botanical medicine. I can identify and prepare medicinal compounds from various plants. I also know several languages of the outer sectors. That's perfect, Jim replied. We trade in medicinal herbs and spices among other things. Your expertise could definitely come in handy. Marco looked impressed. That could open up some new trade routes for us. Medicinal stuff is big market out in the colonies. Jim turned to Marco. Exactly what I was thinking. Marco, why don't you show Lyra the cargo bay later? Give her an idea of what we're working with. Will do, boss, Marco agreed. As Marco left, Jim addressed Lyra again. Now, about your living situation here, this isn't a permanent solution. Once we reach a safe port, we can discuss a more sustainable setup. Lyra's gaze fell. I understand. This arrangement. I don't want to impose more than I have to. Jim shook his head slightly. You're not imposing. We're partners now, right? Partners help each other out. Aaliyah, who had been quietly exploring the small room, looked up. Does that mean we can stay with you? She asked, her voice hopeful. Jim knelt down to her level. For now, yes, Aaliyah. You and your mom are safe here. The little girl smiled, her earlier apprehension melting away into a sense of security. Let's give you a tour of the ship, Jim suggested, changing the topic to lighten the mood. There's plenty to see on the Starbound, and you'll need to know your way around. As they walked through the ship, Jim pointed out the mess hall, the engine room, and the navigation deck, explaining the function of each. Lyra listened intently, asking questions about their routes and the nature of their trades. By the end of the tour, Lyra seemed more at ease, her initial trepidation replaced by a budding curiosity about the life and workings of a trading vessel. We operate like a family here, Jim concluded as they returned to the living quarters. You and Aaliyah are part of that now. Lyra nodded, her expression one of gratitude. Thank you, Jim. We will do our best to contribute. Jim smiled. I know you will. Let's make this a successful voyage for all of us. As they settled into the rhythm of ship life, the unlikely companions began to forge a bond, one that promised mutual benefits and, perhaps, a new definition of family on the boundless frontiers of space. The following days aboard the Starbound brought a routine that Lyra and Aaliyah slowly melded into. Jim found himself often surprised by how quickly they adapted, and how seamlessly Lyra's skills integrated with the crew's needs. One afternoon, in the ship's cramped but functional kitchen, Jim watched as Lyra meticulously sorted through a collection of dried herbs and spices. Marco hovered nearby, genuinely interested in the process. So, each of these has a specific medicinal use? Marco asked, picking up a dried leaf and examining it curiously. Yes, exactly, Lyra explained, her hands expert in their sorting. For instance, this one can help with inflammation, and when combined with what you'd call Jackson berries, it can enhance immune responses. Marco whistled softly. That's handy. We usually just sell these as exotic spices. Never knew they packed such a punch. Jim leaned against the doorway, observing. Think you could whip up a catalog of these combos? It could really give us an edge in some markets. Lyra nodded, a smile breaking through. I'd be glad to. It'll also keep me busy. As they worked, Jim's comm unit beeped. He glanced at the screen and frowned. Looks like we're approaching the Nebulon belt. It's going to get a bit choppy. Marco straightened up, his demeanor shifting to that of his role as second in command. I'll head to the bridge, make sure everything's prepped for a rough ride. Good idea, Jim said, following him out. To Lyra, he added, why don't you and Aaliyah strap in? Safety first, especially in the belt. Lyra nodded, herding Aaliyah towards their quarters. On the bridge, Marco and Jim worked side by side, expertly navigating the Starbound through the asteroid-laden expanse of the Nebulon belt. The ship shuddered as they dodged larger rocks, the external cameras displaying close shaves that would make any seasoned spacer sweat. You ever think about automating more of this? Marco asked as he adjusted the thrusters. Jim shook his head. And miss out on all this fun? Never. Their laughter was cut short by a sudden jolt that sent them both grabbing for the console. That was a close one, Jim muttered, his eyes scanning the readouts. Back in their quarters, Lyra held Aaliyah close, explaining softly about the nature of space travel, turning their precarious situation into a learning moment. Space is like a vast ocean, Aaliyah. It's beautiful but sometimes a bit wild. Aaliyah's eyes were wide with a mixture of fear and fascination. Will we be okay, Mom? Lyra kissed the top of her head. Yes, darling. Jim and Marco are very good at navigating these storms. Once the belt was behind them, the crew gathered in the mess hall for a well-deserved break. Lyra brought out a small batch of her medicinal brew, offering cups to Jim and Marco. "Here's to not being space dust," Jim toasted, raising his cup. Marco took a tentative sip, then smiled. "Hey, this is good. What's in it?" Lyra explained the blend, and the conversation drifted to more of her home remedies and the potential applications for their journey. Jim listened, impressed by her knowledge and the ease with which she shared it. "You know, Lyra, I think you're going to fit in just fine here." Lyra's smile was one of relief and gratitude. "Thank you, Jim. It feels good to be useful, to be part of something." As the stars streaked past outside the viewport, the small but sturdy crew of the Starbound felt closer, more like a Unit A makeshift family forged from necessity, curiosity, and the vast loneliness of space. They had each other, and for now, that was enough. Jim steered the Starbound towards Galliano, a bustling trade outpost on the fringe of the frontier zone. His mind was occupied with their impending trade negotiations, a task usually handled solo, but today, he considered a new approach. "Lyra, how do you feel about joining me for the negotiations today?" Jim asked as they prepared to dock. "Your expertise could give us an edge, especially with the medicinal trades." Lyra appeared surprised but quickly masked it with a calm nod. "I'd be honored to help. I've been studying the trade patterns you showed me. I think I can provide some insights." Jim smiled, pleased. "Great. Let's review our inventory before we land. Marco, you're in charge while we're gone." Marco, polishing a console, gave a thumbs up without looking up. "Got it, boss. We'll keep the ship in one piece." In the cargo bay, Jim and Lyra went through the crates of medicinal herbs, with Jim explaining the usual demand and pricing strategies. Lyra listened intently, interjecting with suggestions on which herbs were rare and could be sold at a premium. As they docked, the hustle of Galliano enveloped them. The outpost was alive with traders from all over the galaxy, shouting, bartering, and hustling. Jim led the way to a familiar stall, where a grizzled old trader named Harlan dealt in specialty goods. "Jim, my boy." Harlan greeted with a toothy grin. "What treasures have you brought me this time?" "Hello, Harlan. I've got something special today," Jim said, gesturing to Lyra. "This is Lyra, an expert in botanical medicines. She's got some insights that might interest you." Harlan's gaze flicked to Lyra, curious. "Is that so? Well then, let's hear it." Lyra stepped forward, her confidence growing. "Good day, Harlan. I've noticed you deal in Zolrian roots. I have a blend that enhances their efficacy when used in healing poultices. I believe it could double their market value." Harlan raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued. "Double, you say? Show me this blend." Lyra opened a small container and detailed the preparation and benefits. Harlan listened, his initial skepticism slowly fading. "Well, I'll be," Harlan finally said. "Jim, you've got yourself a gem here. Let's talk numbers." Jim and Lyra spent the next hour negotiating with Harlan, finally agreeing on a profitable exchange. As they left his stall, Jim clapped Lyra on the back, impressed and proud. "You were fantastic, Lyra. I think you just set a new standard for our trading ventures." Lyra's cheeks flushed with pleasure. "Thank you, Jim. It feels good to be useful." They made a few more stops, Lyra's expertise opening doors that Jim hadn't even considered knocking on before. By the time they returned to the Starbound, they were both laden with contracts and promises of future business. Marco met them at the airlock, grinning. "Looks like you two hit the jackpot out there." "We did," Jim agreed, handing over a thick folder of contracts to Marco. "Take a look at this. Lyra's a natural at this." Marco whistled as he flipped through the documents. "This is solid work. Welcome to the team, Lyra." Lyra smiled, her earlier nervousness replaced by a sense of belonging. "Thank you, Marco. I'm glad to be here." That night, as the Starbound left Galliano behind, the crew gathered in the mess hall to celebrate their successful day. Jim proposed a toast to new beginnings and the unexpected paths they lead us down. "To new partnerships and the roads they open," Jim said, raising his glass. "To new roads," Lyra echoed, her glass clinking with the others. As laughter and conversation filled the small space, the stars outside the viewport seemed to shine a little brighter, reflecting the new bonds formed beneath their light. The Starbound sailed on, its crew more united than ever, their course set on the promise of future adventures together. The Starbound drifted quietly through the starlit void as Jim found himself in the ship's small, makeshift library, with Lyra seated across from him, deeply engrossed in a set of star maps. Their earlier successes had brought them closer, and their conversations had started to drift from strictly professional to personal. "Lyra," Jim began, breaking the silence, You've adapted so well to life here. It's like you were always meant to be aboard. Lyra looked up, a soft smile playing on her lips. Thank you, Jim. It feels like home, which I didn't expect in such a vast emptiness. Jim nodded, appreciating her sentiment. Space does have a way of bringing people together, he remarked, then hesitated as he decided to broach a more personal subject. And how are you and Aaliyah really settling in? Beyond the work and routines? Lyra's expression softened. We are doing well, thanks to you and Marco. Aaliyah is happier, more vibrant. She feels safe, and so do I. It's a relief. The conversation lapsed into a comfortable silence, each lost in thought. After a moment, Jim spoke up again. Lyra, I've been thinking. We've been through quite a bit together. It's made me realize how much I... He paused, searching for the right words. Lyra leaned forward slightly, a curious look in her eyes. How much you what, Jim? How much I value your presence here, Jim continued, feeling a warmth spread through him. Not just for the trading or the work, but for this. Our talks. Lyra blushed slightly, her eyes reflecting the starlight from the viewport. I feel the same, Jim. I didn't expect to find such a connection, especially not here. Encouraged, Jim reached across the table, his hand hesitating in the air before Lyra met it with her own. Their fingers touched, tentatively at first, then clasped. Maybe it's the stars, or the quiet of space, but being here with you it's more than I could have hoped for. Lyra squeezed his hand gently. And I'm grateful for every moment, Jim. Their eyes locked, and a new understanding passed between them. Jim stood, pulling Lyra to her feet, and in the privacy of the library, they shared their first kiss. It was gentle, tentative at first, then deepening as they both acknowledged the feelings that had been quietly growing between them. The kiss broke, and they stood forehead to forehead, breathing each other in. This feels right, Jim murmured, almost as if surprised by the intensity of his own emotions. It does, Lyra agreed softly. But I want to take things slowly, Jim. For Leah's sake, and for ours. Of course, Jim replied, his voice full of understanding. We'll take everything at a pace you're comfortable with. They spent the rest of the evening talking softly, planning cautiously about what their growing bond might mean for their future. It was a conversation full of potential and cautious hope, under the silent watch of the stars. As they eventually left the library, their hands remained linked, a quiet declaration of the new bond they were choosing to explore. The corridors of the Starbound felt less cold, the universe less vast, as they walked together, each step in sync with the others. Their connection was no longer just about survival or convenience, it was about companionship, understanding, and a gentle exploration of shared moments and emotions. As they reached the door to Lyra's quarters, Jim squeezed her hand one last time. "Good night, Lyra," he said softly. "Good night, Jim," she replied, her smile radiant even in the dim light of the corridor. As the door closed behind her, Jim stood there for a moment longer, feeling a contentment he hadn't known he was missing. He turned and walked back to his cabin, his heart lighter, his steps more buoyant. The Starbound sailed on, its path illuminated by stars, its corridors echoing with the quiet sounds of a deepening connection. The usual hum of activity aboard the Starbound was disrupted when Jim received a transmission from an old trading partner, warning him of new regulations being enforced by the Galactic Trade Authority, GTA. These rules posed a direct threat to Lyra and Aaliyah's safety, potentially classifying them as undocumented aliens, which could lead to their detention or worse. Jim called a meeting in the common area, where the crew gathered, including Lyra and a concerned-looking Marco. "We've got a situation," Jim began, his tone serious as he laid out the details. "There are new regulations that could make it dangerous for Lyra and Aaliyah to continue traveling with us. I'm looking at options, but we need to be smart about this." Marco frowned, crossing his arms. "That's bureaucratic nonsense. Lyra and Aaliyah are part of this crew. There's got to be a way to shield them legally." Lyra, who had been quiet, spoke up with a steady voice. "What are our options, Jim?" Jim nodded at Marco, who pulled up a map on the display. "We can reroute to the free zones. They don't comply with GTA regulations and could offer you sanctuary, at least temporarily. That's a long detour, and it'll cost us in trade," Jim added, weighing their options. "But it's worth it." Lyra placed her hand on Jim's arm, her gratitude evident. "Thank you, Jim. I never meant to cause trouble for you or the crew." Jim shook his head firmly. "You're not trouble, Lyra. You're family. We stick together, no matter what." The crew nodded in agreement, their faces set with determination. Marco chimed in with a suggestion. What about your contacts on Mari's station, Jim? Could they forge some documentation to help Lyra and Aaliyah get through checkpoints? Jim considered this, tapping a finger against his chin. It's risky, and not exactly legal, but it might be our best shot at keeping you two safe without diverting too far off our trading routes. I can make the call, Mark offered, already pulling out his communicator. Do it, Jim confirmed, giving Marco a nod of approval. As Marco stepped aside to make the call, Jim turned to Lyra. We'll need to prepare you both. Just in case you need to answer questions or deal with GTA officials. We'll run drills, make sure you know exactly what to say. Lyra nodded, her resolve clear. Whatever it takes. The next few days were a flurry of activity. Marco returned with good news, his contact was willing to help. The crew drilled Lyra and Aaliyah, coaching them on the backstory that would be on their new documents. Jim watched Lyra go through the motions, impressed by her quick learning and adaptability. One evening, after a particularly intense drill session, he pulled her aside. You're handling this incredibly well, he said, his voice full of admiration. Lyra smiled, but her eyes betrayed her worry. I have to be strong, for Aaliyah. And for us. Jim reached out, squeezing her hand. We're almost through this, Lyra. Hold on a little longer. I will, she assured him, squeezing back. Finally, the day came to pass through the GTA checkpoint. The crew was tense as the Starbound approached the station, everyone playing their part flawlessly. Lyra and Aaliyah, now equipped with their forged documents, managed to pass the inspection without raising any suspicions. As the ship cleared the checkpoint and drifted back into the safety of open space, the crew let out a collective sigh of relief. Jim gathered everyone in the common area. We did it, he announced, relief washing over him. Thanks to everyone's efforts, especially Marco's contacts. Lyra, her relief palpable, hugged Aaliyah close. Thank you, all of you, for risking so much for us. It's what families do, Jim said, smiling at his crew. Now, let's get back to our journey. We've got a lot of space to cover. The Starbound continued on its course, its crew more united than ever, their resolve strengthened by the challenges they had overcome together. After navigating through the intricate complexities of space bureaucracy and the close call at the GTA checkpoint, Jim directed the Starbound towards a relatively unknown, but peaceful, planet called Haven. Known for its neutrality and acceptance of all beings, Haven seemed like the perfect place for Lyra and Aaliyah to start anew, away from the prying eyes of the Galactic Trade Authority. As the ship descended through the lush, verdant atmosphere of Haven, Lyra stood beside Jim at the cockpit, her eyes wide with a mixture of hope and apprehension. Is it always this green? Lyra asked, her gaze fixed on the sprawling forests below. It is, Jim replied, smiling at her wonder. Haven's one of the few places in this sector that's managed to remain untouched by industrial expansion. It's a good place for a fresh start. The landing was smooth, and as the crew disembarked, they were greeted by a delegation of Haven locals. The leader, a tall, gentle-eyed man named Karan, extended his hands in welcome. Greetings, travelers. Welcome to Haven. We hope you find peace here, Karan said, his voice warm. Jim stepped forward, shaking Karan's hand. Thank you, Karan. We're grateful for your hospitality. As introductions were made, Lyra and Aaliyah were welcomed with the same warmth and openness. The community's genuine acceptance was palpable, and Lyra felt a weight lift off her shoulders, a feeling she hadn't experienced in a long time. Karan guided them through the settlement, a harmonious blend of nature and modest technology. Many who come to Haven are seeking refuge from the chaos of the galaxy. Here, they find a community where all are valued, he explained. Jim listened intently, impressed by the community's simple yet effective structure. It's impressive what you've built here. I can see why it's called Haven. As they walked, Marco leaned over to Jim. Boss, this place might also be good for trading. Peaceful planets have rare commodities. Jim nodded, his mind already turning over the possibilities. Let's set up a meeting with their trade council. See if we can establish a new route. The next day, Jim and Marco met with Haven's trade representatives while Lyra and Aaliyah explored their new home. The negotiations went smoothly, with both sides eager to establish a relationship built on mutual benefit and respect. Meanwhile, Lyra and Aaliyah wandered through a local market, marveling at the exotic fruits and handcrafted goods. Aaliyah, holding a handcrafted doll, looked up at her mother. Can we really stay here, Mom? For good? Lyra knelt down, brushing a strand of hair from Aaliyah's face. Yes, my love. We can stay here as long as we like. That evening, the Starbound crew gathered at a local eatery, celebrating the successful negotiations and the new life ahead for Lyra and Aaliyah. Jim raised his glass in a toast. "To new beginnings and lasting peace," he declared, his voice filled with genuine happiness for Lyra and her daughter. "To new beginnings," the crew echoed, their glasses clinking in the soft light of the setting sun. After dinner, Jim pulled Lyra aside, his expression serious yet kind. "You know, you don't have to decide right away. The Starbound is always open to you and Aaliyah." Lyra smiled, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I know, Jim. And we're more grateful than you can imagine. But I think we've found our place here. It's time for us to build something lasting." Jim nodded, understanding her need for stability. "Then consider Haven an extended stop on your journey with us. And remember, we're just a comm call away." As the stars appeared in the twilight sky, Lyra and Aaliyah stood hand in hand, their hearts full of hope for the future. Haven wasn't just a sanctuary, it was a new beginning, a place where they could finally put down roots and perhaps find the peace they had longed for. On the morning of the Starbound's departure from Haven, the air was bittersweet. Jim stood with Lyra and Aaliyah at the edge of the settlement, overlooking a vast expanse of rolling hills that glinted under the rising sun. "It's hard to say goodbye," Jim admitted, looking down at Aaliyah, who clutched a small model of the Starbound that Marco had made for her. Aaliyah looked up at him with wide, earnest eyes. "You will visit us, right?" Jim ruffled her hair, smiling. "Of course, we will. And you can always message us on the comm whenever you want." Lyra, standing beside them, held a small datapad, her gift from the crew filled with recipes and medical knowledge she'd gathered from across the galaxy. "I can't thank you enough, Jim. For everything." Jim shook his head gently. "No, thank you, Lyra. You've given as much to us as we've given to you. This isn't the end. It's just a new chapter." Marco, who had been talking to some of the local children, joined them, his usual grin in place. "Don't make us get all sentimental now. You know the Starbound is always your home. Plus, you need to keep us updated on all the planned experiments you're gonna do here." Lyra laughed, a sound of genuine happiness. "I will. And maybe discover some new remedies to share with you." As they walked back towards the heart of the settlement, Karan joined them, his presence a comforting constant in the community. "Jim, your ship and crew will always be welcome here in Haven. You've helped bring us some valuable connections." "We appreciate that, Karan," Jim replied. "And we're leaving part of our family with you. Take good care of them." Karan nodded solemnly. "It is our honor and pleasure. Haven thrives because of the strength and diversity of its people. Lyra and Aaliyah will add to that strength." As the time for departure drew near, the entire settlement seemed to have come out to bid farewell to the Starbound crew. There was a feeling of community and shared warmth, a testament to the relationships that had been forged during their brief but impactful stay. Back aboard the Starbound, Jim and Marco watched from the command deck as Haven receded into the distance. Marco clapped Jim on the shoulder. "You okay, boss?" Jim took a deep breath, his eyes not leaving the viewport. "Yeah, I'm good. It's always tough leaving family behind, but I think they're where they're meant to be." Marco nodded, understanding his captain's mixed emotions. "Well, the galaxy's not going to trade with itself. What's our next destination?" Jim turned, a new light in his eyes, the weight of farewell lifting as he considered their next adventure. "Let's head to the Orion Belt. There's a new mining colony there. Might be a good opportunity for some trade." "Back to business, then," Marco said, his voice cheerful. "You know, those miners love their spices. Maybe it's time to test out some of Lyra's new recipes." Jim chuckled, the familiar thrill of anticipation bubbling within him. "Yeah, let's see if we can spice up the Orion Belt a little." As the Starbound surged forward, cutting through the cosmic sea, Jim looked back one last time at the shrinking speck that was Haven. He felt a surge of hope not just for Lyra and Aaliyah, but for the continuing journeys of the Starbound and its crew. The universe was vast, and their adventures were far from over.